Welcome to the second podcast in the Decolonial Ecologies, Planetary Crisis, and Climate Change in Latin American Studies series. Today's guest is Macarena Gómez-Barris, a great feminist thinker. Macarena Gómez-Barris is a writer and scholar who works at the intersections of art, environment, queer praxis, and decolonization. She is the author of 4 books: Where Memory Dwells, Culture and State Violence in Chile from 2009, The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives from 2017. She's also the author of Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Political Undercurrents in the Americas from 2018, and Towards a Sociology of a Trace from 2010 in co-authorship with Herman Gray. She's completing 2 new books, which we're very much looking forward to, on the colonial anthropocene, At the Sea's Edge, Beyond Coloniality and Extinction, forthcoming with Duke University Press, and Latchkey, a work of fiction set in the 1980s in the Sierra Nevada foothills of Northern California. She's also the founding director of the Global South Center and chairperson of the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. Today's podcast is titled Transversal and Decolonial Ecologies. In this first introductory section, Macarena will talk about her book, The Extractive Zone, and its consequences on her current scholarship. Specifically, she'll talk about war against the earth and racialized people ongoing since the 15th century. And she will examine how forms of collective power that defy racial and extractive capitalism are expressed in arts of land and water defense.
Today, what I want to do is talk for a while, show you some work, show you some examples, and then really have a fleshed out discussion. Especially, thank you for reading my work. I think it's so helpful if you have some background in the concepts, because I really felt that I had to invent a conceptual language in the extractive zone for some of the processes that I was naming. And so it's really useful if you've done some of that background. And this really continues from that work today. So what I want to do is draw upon corporal engagements and interventions and think with you about the war against the earth, and really a war against the earth and also against racialized peoples since the 15th century, a war that persists today. I also want to think about disappearing human and other than human, to not say non-human, bodies of extractivores. And I believe they demand our urgent political and academic study and new forms of representation. And the forms of representation that I'm going to talk about today are just one piece of a much larger framework that we could talk about, and if you'd like to in Q&A. I also want to think about something that I'm calling the arts of land and water defense. And I'd suggest that it gives us part of the answer to our current global predicament, not all of it. My scholarship has been in studies of coloniality and questions of empire, and I've been researching forms of collective power, forms of somatic power, forms of performative power that defy but are not fully absorbable by racial and extractive capitalism. And I'm interested in other means of relating. Perhaps we might call these non-extractive relations, imagine that, and that I think that are very present in the arts of land and water defense. So let me define that for you first. The arts of land and water defense are modes of artistic and political inquiry. They're ways of thinking and doing otherwise. And I think they have to be tethered to indigenous ontologies and territories to deepen how we understand social life. These arts are not aesthetic objectifications for an extractive art market, nor do I want to say be prescriptive and make prescriptive claims about what art should and should not do. Instead, I'm interested in a kind of situated ethnography and which is difficult to do right now, but I do think we can have mediated forms of ethnography, decolonial ethnography, and also textured analysis. And these have allowed me to actually think about creative practices of artists and scholars and social movements that are situated at the frontier of settler colonial political regimes. So let me just say from the outset that in a climate change world where extreme weather, extreme fires, and the quick accelerating pace of destruction is difficult, right? And terrible. The arts of land and water defense are just one part of a much larger and a myriad set of approaches that we need to kind of quickly coordinate and also accelerate as antidotes to the colonial Anthropocene. And it should be clear by the end of the talk what I'm referring to when I mention the colonial Anthropocene, if it's not clear on the outset. So we know this is pressing in upon us, this colonial Anthropocene. We've experienced it, right, through the differential impact of COVID-19. But how to create antidotes is part of my central concern today. And I talk about those, not surprising if you've read my work, as hemispheric, as artistic, and political approaches to this set of questions.
In this second section, titled Sovereignty Otherwise, Professor Gómez-Barris will examine how indigenous forms of sovereignty counter nation-state vertical forms of power which rule over the other. She will also analyze an example of arts of land and water defense through the artwork of Colombian artist Carolina Caicedo and her photographs of rivers.
Let me begin by speaking about sovereignty because it's such an important term in how we think about all kinds of forms of movements today, as kind of sovereignty otherwise. So certainly the nation state has one form of discussing this of sovereignty, right? And that sovereignty is often about a kind of sovereign rule, a vertical form of power, a rule over the other. I'm interested here in talking about indigenous forms of sovereignty. They're often carried in the body and inhabit the land. And these are against the idea of a kind of territorial integrity or the granting of individual rights by unified supreme authority. So indigenous and Afro-Indigenous sovereignty in the Americas do not come from the Constitution, and they're not activated by the gun or the military, but they're instead anchored in specific relationships to territory and in relationship to each other. And that's the non-extractive relation piece, that the kind of relationality that we tether in relationship to each other. So in Abiyala, for instance, which is the indigenous term for the Americas, complex relations exist between the worldly and the other world and human and non-human exchanges. Indeed, as indigenous practices have showed us, the body and the land have been thought together. And this is at the heart of the epistemic difference with Western ontologies, that the body is not severed from territory, the body is not severed from land. And you might be thinking, well, in 1980s white liberal feminism, there was this whole move to not discuss the body and the land together. Are we going backwards? And I would suggest, actually, if we think from indigenous models of sovereignty and decolonial feminist perspectives, we would never separate the body from the land. I would also suggest that indigenous forms of sovereignty are often grounded within layers of affinity or kinship, and they often derive from something that's called the intersubstantiation of ancestral beings, humans, non-humans, and land. So there's not this hierarchy of chain of being that's so central to the kind of European model of ontology. I'm going to ground this discussion in a minute, but I want to give you some concepts to lead us into this. So for me, in my own work, having hit an impasse with kind of overburdened and normative vocabularies of political experience, I began to use the term submerged perspectives And I use this to tend to other levels of perception, other sensibilities or material practices that are organized below or underneath the radar, say, of the modern colonial order, and that often go undetected by regimes of state power. So if you listen closely as I move in this talk, you'll hear me use the term power many times. And I think we have to really think about the kind of models of power and descriptors of power that we're talking about today in the world at large. So submerged perspectives are ontologies, and these look for legitimacy elsewhere. These are not interested in looking towards the kind of property rights that are guaranteed by the nation state in its legal apparatus. And these are forms of knowing, feeling, and being, or submerged perspectives that actually, as I argue today, and I'll show through some examples, unsettle the asymmetrical relations to land and water. And they also, to use Jose Munoz, the queer Latinx, deceased but wonderful theorist, they disidentify, they do not identify with settler governmentality, right? And if we think about a kind of settler state or a settler system of governance, we'd talk about the fact that it's fundamentally reorganized indigenous and Afro-descended territories into a 19th century nation state that we continue to live with today. And also, this is the work of extractive industries. So let me ground this so you can see what I'm talking about. For instance, the Yuma River that crosses this map, renamed the Magdalena River during the Spanish conquest, flows for 949 miles from the center of Afro-diasporic geographies of the Caribbean there in the northern part of the map, through the Amazonian basin and into the Andean highlands. My decolonial approach here centers this referential ecology of the river, the geography of the river, and its ever-changing flows, its tributaries, its headways, its shores, its alluvial deposits, and not the national and historical temporal boundaries, in order to see what is submerged within the developmental schemes of the nation state. So I want to turn then briefly to the idea of dams and damming, which blocks the kind of flow of the river. You may know that in Spanish, the term for dams is actually represa, right? Represa, the literal translation is to repress the flow of the river. But also, damming depends upon a kind of extractive matrix of massive displacement and state violence. Specifically, the forced removal of hundreds of thousands of indigenous and mestiza peasants in the Cauca Valley in southwestern Colombia. And this forced removal is carried out by the Colombian state. And this is an image by Carolina Caicedo, who I talk about extensively in the extractive zone. And I talk about this kind of drone perspective and this inverted view that she has that looks, if you look below at the image, it says Rios Vivos, living rivers, right? To a kind of geochoreography that's literally made up of the bodies of local anti-extractive land and water defenders. And one of the things that we were talking about today is the way in which the body itself is so tethered to land in these kinds of communities. So that's one of the things I wanted to raise. During a gathering they called Rios Vivos, or Living Rivers, that I attended in the Huila department of southwestern Colombia, community members make communal pots of stew from freshly caught river fish, and they cook and they tell stories, and they remember the martyrs of those who are actually fighting against the hydroelectric dam Endesa, by the corporation Endesa, that's both Italian Ingelsa and also Endesa with Spanish origins, and has a very big headquarters actually in Chile. So this is the work that they're doing, is this kind of anti-extractive work. And they're remembering their political martyrs, people who have been killed or disappeared or put in jail as they're doing this work against a hydroelectric dam. And they also use the artisanal fishing net as a way to talk about their interdependence against the forces they describe as individuating, rupturing, and brutally authoritarian. There's also this way in which they're using environmental collective memory and environmental testimonials there to narrate displacement in a shared sense of mourning and loss. And if you've been studying the Americas for a while, you know that in the Cold War and the 1980s, the testimonial for the families of the disappeared and the mothers of the disappeared was so important, this human rights testimonial, as well as forms of collective memory that anchored into the earth to show the places of disappearance. Well, this is interesting because this is building upon that legacy of collective action, and it's using it to describe this deep environmental displacement and this climate change dispossession, but also the developmental schemes of the state. So the environmental testimonials then are collective and they narrate displacement and the shared sense of mourning and loss. But they also talk about a profound historical identification with the river through these collective performances. And I want to just lift that idea of the performance and remind me to return to it, because I think it's quite complicated in relationship to some of the research that I've done, but also it's not a term that's universally loved in communities of struggle. So we are not just defenders of the river, we are the river is this powerful ritual that makes visible the deep connections of indigenous peoples to territory and begins to locate the river as a protagonist of history. It's also about the work of Aso-Kimbo that thinks about this distributed space of relationality. What I want to suggest as part of the work is that Carolina Caicedo, the kind of activisms of Aso-Kimbo, anti-extractive work that's being done on the ground, literally is doing this kind of mediation work and solidarity work. And here in this particular image, what Carolina is doing is taking a satellite and drawing over the tracing of the Ghost River with her hand in dark ink over satellite images and literally drawing back the living path of the Yuma River. So one of the things I want to draw from, and I talked about this in the extractive zone, but I'm taking yet another discussion from this very same visual form again today. One of the things I want to say is that we also have to think about the ways in which we're drawing back in the scorched earth landscapes into the places where military technologies and satellites have opened up new extractive corridors or new mega dams, as they have in this department in the hydroelectricity work and the corporate work of the energy giant Agense. So these are the kinds of arts of land and water defense that I want to bring forward. And part of the work that I do is really to reveal kind of this submerged perspective and to bring forward this kind of protagonism. So I also talk about this earth being in Land of Friends. And if you have a chance to see it on Vimeo, it's quite a powerful film that also is working with scale. But if you notice at the center here, she's taking Yuma and she inverts the frame and then doubles it to create this powerful earth being at the center of the frame here.
In this third section titled Exhaustion and Occupation, Professor Gómez-Barris will analyze another form of art of land and water defense. Specifically, she will talk about the Guatemalan mestizo artist Regina Galindo and her performance video La Sombra, The Shadow from 2017, and her performance work titled Earth from 2015.
Let me move from that example to the question of exhaustion and occupation. And exhaustion is something that certainly we know as teachers, as students, as administrators, as Zoomers in this moment and in relationship to kind of COVID-19. But I want to bring it into the foreground to discuss the kind of haunting work that someone like Guatemalan mestiza artist Regina Galindo does in her video work called La Sombra, or The Shadow, which I think is a powerful piece of video performance, but it also provides us this kind of another layer, if you will, of the arts of land and water defense. The Shadow, La Sombra, is a work commissioned by Documenta in Kassel, Germany, and it was shown there in 2017 by Ladina Guatemalan performance artist. She's dressed in black here with her long dark hair framing her brown face and body. In the video, the artist's primary activity is an effort to outrun a large army tank that chases her down. Filmed in the forest surrounding Kassel, and you might know that Kassel was actually a city that manufactured the majority of the armored tanks used during the Nazi period. So it's not, that's really interesting to think about the kind of manufacturing of weapons alongside a kind of supposed independent kind of European art event like Kassel's, right? So this kind of centering of Kassel's is what Galindo does to reference this global history and to think with us about weapon fabrication and distribution, and also what it means to live in the shadow of empire and global capitalism, and then think back to the kind of modern origins of fascism, which is certainly relevant for our times. Towards the end of the film, we hear a kind of piercing cry of exhaustion and the moan of not being able to outpace the war machine of occupation. So I'd suggest she's trying to do many things with this important kind of work, that it's powerful work to center the female racialized body in the foreground. And rather than think about these alternative energy sources, what does it mean to think about the energy of a brown mestiza, woman, the racialized female body in the foreground that powers the extractive scene and actually powers the anthropocene. So La Sombra really brings then the war machine and the afterlives and imperial occupation to the foreground. But the main and most important thing I'd suggest she's doing here is bringing three things into sharp relief by using her body as the center here. She's thinking about the triptych structure of ecocide, feminicide, and genocide, right? And given that she comes from Guatemala and she has done extensive work on the Civil War, this is not a stretch to say this. So the triptych structure of ecocide, feminicide, and genocide, and I can say more about that in at the end. But let me say a little bit more now. Galindo offers us the kind of submerged perspective of a powerful figure of the hunted and the haunted racialized femme body that barely is outpacing the machine. And here in her work, Earth, there's no possibility of us looking at this wound of Earth without recalling the terrifying histories of the racial order, the landed elite and their colonial plantations throughout the Americas, and the state terror that wreaked havoc upon organized rebellion. And so there, I'm extending the discussion. We can think Haiti, and the uprising there. We can think about all kinds of uprisings during the Cold War. But really, it's this extractive scene where the first to modernize is this bulldozer, right? The civilizing machine of monoculture. And if you think about Standing Rock, hashtag no DAPL, and what happened there in terms of protests upon Sioux territories a few years ago, first it was the bulldozer, and then came the dogs and the military tanks and the rubber bullets and the pepper spray and the private guard. So there's an order to this kind of extractive work where the racialized femme body sits at the center of it. The extractive machine has also been particularly brutal in relationship to Maya Quiche peoples whose territories cross what since 1902 is the border between southern Mexico and Guatemala. In the counterinsurgency campaigns of the US-backed Cold War, or what is most commonly known as the Civil War that lasted between 1960 and 1996, taking the fish out of the water literally referred to severing the indigenous body from territorialized communal life by quote unquote draining the swamp. So we know that language that's been used so much by 45 was used so much by 45 in the United States. The draining the swamp kind of language actually is an artifact of the kind of counterterrorism wars of the 1980s. And I think this is in part how we can think about this, this work by Galindo. By the late 1990s in Guatemala, 200,000 people had been killed, mostly by the US-trained military regime, 90% of whom were indigenous. 400 small communities were eradicated, and many unmarked graves continued to be unearthed. The wound of the earth, then, is also the burial site of bodies, literally in the soil, or the collective we of the indigenous Maya-Quiche body and land relations within the violent afterlives of imperial sovereignty. So I'm using sovereignty differently there now. In the chemical toxicities in the decimated ruins of US empire within Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, and Guatemala, we might note how the Cold War was not just about winning hearts and minds, but more profoundly an epic grab for non-renewable resources, environmental degradation that created this explosive condition for the recent migrations from Central America across southern Mexico into northern Mexico, and then into the United States and Canada. So the kind of discussion of deportation goes back to this kind of origin place and to the kind of severing that I'm describing here in the civil wars that has its underpinnings in the colonial wars. So there's a lot of history to track through quickly, but I just want you to think about these layers of coloniality that are inscribed into land, into body, and the way in which artistic and political formations are trying to speak back to those layers or lift up those submerged perspectives. So these are ways in which artists are working to write coloniality and imperialism back into the long arc of war against the earth, and also ways to center the racialized female body. So this is part of what I'm referring to as the arts of land and water defense, and also as a model for power and energy that is non-extractive. And we can go back to that because I feel like I've only partially touched on that, but what is a model? I would pose it to you all. What is a model of power and energy that is non-extractive? And I think, you know, the kind of racialized femme body is pointing us that way. As Lenca, land and river defender Berta Cáceres put it before her murder by 6 militiamen on March 3rd, 2016 in Honduras, quote, "The indigenous female body is literally the last obstruction to capital," end quote. So what does it mean then to actually think about the ways in which someone like Berta Cáceres, who was murdered for her environmental work and for her indigenous rights work, and because she was an LGBTQI activist, what does it mean to bring all these things to bear into thinking about exhaustion and the war against the earth now?
In this fourth section, Professor Gómez-Barris will talk about the colonial anthropocene. She will analyze the brutal forces that aim at separating the indigenous body from the territory, especially in the Biobío region of southern Chile, in different historical periods. She will also examine the work of Mapuche artist Francisco Huichaqueo and briefly talk about the 2019 uprisings in Chile.
If we move from Mayan Quiche and Lenca territories within Central America to the deep southern territories of the Mapuche peoples in the Biobío region of southern Chile, we can see the brutal and specific forces that continually work to separate the indigenous body from the land. And there are many ways this took place here. And just a brief kind of overview of this. It first took place through the terror of the colonial militias in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that led to a massive and ongoing Mapuche rebellion from its very inception. Second, during the 19th century processes of nation building, where the Republican Chilean state offered citizenship rights and land grants to white European settler immigrants from Germany, Switzerland, Poland, and Italy. And third, through the reducciones, or land reductions, that forced Mapuche, Pehuenche, and Huiliche peoples onto reservation tracts. So the final piece of the attempted eradication has taken place now through the expansion of radius pine and eucalyptus plantations, and this has taken place through 30 years. It's also taken place by new hydroelectric dams, also by the corporation Endesa, but also by actually making a tree extinct. We call it the monkey puzzle tree in English. In Mapudungun, the Mapuche language, it's called the Pehuen tree, which has been the center of Mapuche daily life, but it's become nearly extinct with these new pine plantations. In the sepia-toned anonymous photograph, we see Mapuche women and children survivors sitting together after they've been rounded up by the military, and they've been called here the remainder of the genocidal campaign. And this image was taken a little more than 2 decades after the massacres of indigenous people during something that's terrifyingly called the pacification of the Araucaria, which was an occupation, a military occupation that lasted between 1861 and 1883. And what it did was annex the southern third of the Chilean nation state. But I want us to think differently also about nation, and think from Mapu, or an indigenous perspective of territory that crosses between nations. And to also think about the ongoing war from the 1990s forward, and the way in which Mapuche peoples continue to be, having to face kind of ongoing destruction. This is the work that has been done in an experimental film by Francisco Huichagueo, the Mapuche director. And I talked about this work in Extractivism. The powerful kind of lament here, the decolonial mourning of the ancestors here, is about the confusion. And the lament is not being able to find the Pehuen forest, because the Pehuen forest actually anchored the historical memory of Mapuche peoples. And in the place of those anchorings are now these radius pine plantations, as monoculture, the kind of settler approach to eradication of the ancestral trees. And so you hear this lament, and the confused kind of cacophony of the sound, and the way in which the elements of wind, and then you see actually a figure that's pointing. And I want to talk and think with you more about the pointing, because Galindo has this kind of moment in her video where she's pointing, and now Huichagueo is pointing as if to think about the other side of the colonial divide, a time of reckoning, a time beyond occupation. And then I'm going to end also with another pointing, so we can come back to that idea of who's pointing, who's accountable, and what does it mean to think about time beyond coloniality. So this idea of pinos, 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 and then at the end of the film, we see a young woman, a young Mapuche woman, and she's calling to action, and she's before the symbol, the Chilean symbol, which reads razón y fuerza, reason and force, the colonial state, basically, and she's basically calling for action alongside the kultrun drum. You see it at the very end. And then you see these kind of haunting figures of very color saturated women and men and children, Mapuche dream state, the Bermenton, a kind of time of marching together, a time of thinking collectively. So In the extractive zone, when I discussed this opening, I also talked about how Huichagueo, the filmmaker, showed this to an audience of very few people in Valdivia in southern Chile. And I said to him, well, who was it made for then? And he says, this is actually made as an archive of the future. But recently, in 2019, when you have this Chilean uprising, and if you want to read more about the Chilean uprising, I put an article that I wrote out of field work that I did in November and December of 2019, right before the pandemic, that links basically what was happening in Santiago to Mapuche territories. And at the time, I also talked to this filmmaker, Huichagueo, through video chat. I wasn't able to see him at the time. And he said he had been in hiding. And he was in hiding because he feared that the state would come for him because he was so able to visualize the occupation on Mapuche territories that his own life was in danger. And I said to him, what do you think about that future archive? And he said to me, well, actually, the temporality of the future that organizes this film has actually come forward. This is the time of the now, he said, a time, world, space of colonial reckoning. And this is one point that I want to make because we know that right prior to the pandemic, we saw a lot of takedowns of colonial monuments and a lot of this kind of anti-colonial activity. And it was really important that it also happened out of indigenous territories first.
In her conclusions, Professor Gómez-Barris will talk about the interlinks between water and land defense, tied especially to indigenous territories, and the recent uprisings seen all over in the Americas that placed bodies against the state. She will touch upon the work of Chilean collective Las Tesis, the book by Argentine scholar Veronica Gago, International Feminism from 2019, and the artworks of Mapuche artist Sebastián Calfuqueo.
What does it mean to interlink these struggles of water and land defense, of indigenous territories with the kind of uprisings we're seeing across the Americas in relationship to bodies and the state and against all kinds of forms of violence? Well, I would suggest that we read and think with the collective Las Tesis, but also with Veronica Gagos in her book on international feminisms. And this literally translates, and this was a kind of geochoreography, another geochoreography or a form of feminist collective action. I don't know if you all had the chance to see these protests, but you can look them up. And the important work of using the body, and of course now everyone would have a mask and there wouldn't be so many bodies, but taking over the public square and the literal pointing to the state as the site of violation. Veronica Gago asks us to think about this and asks us to think about the feminist strike and what it means to demand through a multi-vocal position that abandons the position of victimization and instead creates a strong analysis across multiply situated positions within economies that depend upon dispossession, like capitalism does, within extractive situations like the ones I've been pointing out, within spaces of social reproduction, within spaces of undervaluing the work of women and children, within some of the work that I've done, for instance, in mining economies and the women and children that work in the slag piles there, within spaces of colonialism and patriarchy. La Tesis collective and alongside Gagos ask us to think about these powerful embodied expressions, these forms of transfeminist analysis, and to actually ask for accountability from those in power, to literally point to the colonial state. But I think there are other ways to do this as well, and they are these artistic forms. And in this final work, I want to point to this Mapuche artist, Sebastián Calfuqueo, who I'm working with very intentionally now. And we have work that's going to come out in the Serpentine Gallery on Trans Day, International Day, which is March 26th. And the important work of actually thinking about, again, the trans body, indigenous body together with the liquid surround. By showing their back to the camera, Calfuqueo literally turns away from our extractive and colonial gaze, folding instead into the two-spirit mirror of a liquid embrace. They are thinking with us about untranslatability and the difficulty of transiting, as I have in this talk, between English and Spanish, and in their case, bringing Mapudungun there, of making their mapuche gender and sex transitivity central, of using not just terms like trans or trans asterisk, but also describing their gender, multiple identities and multiple sex identities as weye, alcadomo, antucuram, kangichi, or terms within Mapudungun that signify and multiply the category of non-binary. So I want to end with this because for me, they're working against these normalizing logics, working against monocultural, trying to think about a pluriverse of systems, and working against the erasure of the colonial archive that would just name one form of alternative sexuality as the third gender. They're also interested in bringing forward the kind of questions of the liquid and the importance of water and how it's being sold in our moment. Water, as we know, is not a renewable resource. It's not going to last forever. It's exhaustive, but it's also this liquid transit space that allows us to think about the arts of land and water defense, and also make visible from the heart of Walmapu, from the heart of indigenous territories, some ways of speaking back to the colonial anthropocene. So thank you for listening.